In its 2023 annual report on military and security developments involving China, the US Department of Defense stated that China has not reduced its massive additional military deployments along the line of actual control with India. It further stated that China continued to develop infrastructure along the LAC, including new roads, helipads, airport, and new villages in the disputed areas of neighboring Bhutan. The findings of the report are significant in the context of an ongoing process of disengagement between the Indian and the Chinese troops in certain friction points in eastern Ladakh since Galwan happened in 2020. But wait, how did we actually get here? This is precisely what we seek to address in our two-part series on the Chinese conundrum and its implications for India and the world. Herein, to fully understand the gravity of the situation, it is essential to delve into the historical context and the rapid transformation of global power dynamics brought about by China's meteoric rise. So without further ado, let's get started. The India-China border standoff is a long-standing and a complex issue marked by sporadic incidents and disputes along the shared border, which is known as the LAC. The current LAC that forms the unmarked and ambiguous border partially adheres to the British-drawn boundaries. The India-China boundary dispute is divided into three sectors: the western sector, the middle sector, and the eastern sector. Now, in the western sector, the conflict between the two countries mainly pertains to claims and counterclaims in Ladakh and the Aksai areas. This is where the story gets a little complicated. This is because India considers Aksai as part of Ladakh based on the lines drawn on maps by the British from time to time to indicate the extent of their empire in the Indian subcontinent. Until 1947, three lines defined the boundaries of Ladakh, namely the Johnson Line, the Johnson-Ardagh Line, and the McCartney-MacDonald Line. The first attempt towards boundary demarcation in Ladakh was made by a British civil servant, W.H. Johnson, in 1865, which marked Jammu and Kashmir along with Aksai as part of India. Also called the Johnson Line, the British government discounted it as there were inaccuracies in the map. Later, in 1897, a British military officer, John Ardagh, modified the Johnson Line and it became the Johnson-Ardagh Line. The Chinese, however, did not acknowledge this. But since India's independence, even though the boundary in the Aksai sector is described as undemarcated, New Delhi's boundary claims since 1947 were based on this line itself. But the larger question here is, why did the British actually get into boundary demarcations at all? Well, the answer lies in the Great Game. To understand the Great Game, we need to go back in the timeline a bit. It was a term coined by Rudyard Kipling to describe the political and diplomatic confrontation that existed for most of the 19th century between the British Empire and the Russian Empire over Afghanistan and the neighboring territories in Central and South Asia. On one hand, Russia was fearful of British commercial and military inroads into Central Asia, and on the other, the Britain was fearful of Russia adding the jewel in the crown, India, to the vast empire that Russia was building in Asia. As part of this, Britain favored a revision of the prevailing boundary and ceding the underpopulated border territory to China. Hence, in the year 1899, the British reworked the border map to come up with the McCartney-MacDonald Line, which approximately divided the areas of Aksai between India and China. As a result, until the year 1958, China unofficially accepted this line as the boundary between the two countries. Now, despite being responsible for drawing these boundaries, one can assume that British must have sorted these out. Well, not really. The British did not pursue any of these to their logical conclusion. Later, as a result, they became bones of contention as India chose to go with the Johnson Line while the Chinese opted for the McCartney-MacDonald Line. It was in this context that the then Prime Minister Pandit Nehru and the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai exchanged notes in 1959 and Beijing proposed a line of actual control based on the McCartney-MacDonald Line, which was subsequently rejected by India. This was the story behind the western sector. Let's move on to the middle sector, where Tibet borders the Indian states of Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand. The dispute herein is a minor one. In fact, it is the only sector where India and China have exchanged maps on which they broadly agree despite no formal demarcation of boundaries. But the tale of the eastern sector is again complicated, as was the case with the western sector. Herein, it is important to introduce another convention that happened in the British India era named the Shimla Convention. The Shimla Convention, signed by the British India and Tibet in July 1914, gave birth to the McMahon line separating Tibet from India. Although the convention recognized that Tibet forms part of the Chinese territory, the then Chinese authorities did not sign the convention on objections over degree and nature of suzerainty of China over Tibet. Now the year 1914, if we remember correctly, was a turbulent time for the world. The First World War followed the Shimla Convention in a matter of weeks, and since Britain and China were on the same side, neither Britain nor China made any positive declarations about Chinese rights and privileges outside the Shimla Convention. From the time of signing of the Shimla Convention till 1959, the Chinese never raised any formal objections to the McMahon line. However, on January 23, 1959, for the first time ever, the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai raised formal objections over the McMahon line with the then Prime Minister of India, citing that it was a product of British policy of aggression against the Tibetan region. They also concluded that the Sino-Indian boundary had never been formally delimited and that no territory or agreement had been concluded between the Chinese central government and the government of India. Now you must be wondering as to why the objections were raised in 1959 and not earlier. Well, the answer to this question lies in the history of China and its internal politics in the first half of the 20th century itself. But before the 20th century, China was ruled by imperial dynasties. The last of these dynasties was the Qing dynasty, also called the Manchu dynasty, which ruled from 17th century till the first decade of the 20th century. In October 1911, a group of revolutionaries under the leadership of Dr. Sun Yat-sen in southern China led a successful revolt against the Qing dynasty, establishing in its place the Republic of China. The emperor and the royal family abdicated the throne in February 1912. Though the new government created the Republic of China, it failed to unify the country under its control. Additionally, the reforms set in place by the new government were not nearly as sweeping as the revolutionary rhetoric had intended. Amidst this background, the Communist Party of China was officially formed in 1921. Later, the death of Sun Yat-sen brought Chiang Kai-shek to the fore, who broke with the communists and confirmed the governing Kuomintang as a nationalist party. Further, the Shanghai Massacre of Communists in 1927 on the orders of Chiang Kai-shek inadvertently led to the creation of the Communist Red Army. In 1931, a civil war broke out between the Red Army and the Nationalist Party, which led to an 18-year-long conflict. In 1949, after a violent end stage to the civil war, the Communist Party declared the People's Republic of China, and the Communist Party of China's chairman Mao Zedong became the China's new leader. Now let's connect the dots and get back to the dispute we were discussing. Because of the internal conflicts in China till Mao Zedong's rule, the Chinese did not, or rather could not, focus on the external matters. However, the change of leadership and ideology of the government in China resulted in fresh claims and counterclaims by the Chinese authorities vis-a-vis India and other neighbors. Now let's resume our story about the eastern sector. Initially, as part of the disputes in the eastern sector, China only had claimed the Tawang region, but since 1980s, Beijing started to claim all of Arunachal Pradesh as part of South Tibet territory. Here, what is interesting to note is that in 1960, China accepted the McMahon line to settle the border dispute with Myanmar. Moreover, China settled the boundary with Nepal in 1960 according to the watershed principle, which is also followed by the McMahon line. This clearly demonstrates China's biased treatment of the McMahon line. In the context of the evolving India-China border situation, the invasion and annexation of Tibet by China in 1950 also needs a special mention here. After the proclamation of People's Republic of China in 1949, the Communist Party of China made the annexation of Tibet a top priority to shore up China's southwestern borders and access Tibet's plentiful natural resources. After the invasion of Tibet by the Chinese army, also called the People's Liberation Army, the Tibetan administration was forced to sign an agreement with Chinese which effectively subordinated Tibet to China. However, it also assured non-interference in the domestic administration, Tibetan culture and religion. But soon the Chinese began violating the agreement and large-scale communist reforms were introduced in many provinces of Tibet. There was interference in all aspects of Tibetan life, from schooling to cultural beliefs. By 1954, resistance in Tibet was growing as the Chinese began destroying monasteries and imposing collectivization. Now you must be wondering why we have started discussing Tibet all of a sudden and how it is linked with India. Well, the answer lies in 1959, when a major revolt erupted in Lhasa, which was a culmination of a 6-year resistance against the Chinese annexation. Chinese reprisal to the revolt were brutal and led to the killing of more than 80,000 Tibetans. Later, on March 23, 1959, the Dalai Lama fled Lhasa and repudiated the earlier agreement with Chinese and proclaimed himself as Tibet's sole legitimate representative. He also sought asylum from India, which was granted by the Government of India in April 1959. And since 1959, China's hold over Tibet has been absolute. Now, after the grant of asylum to the Dalai Lama in 1959, skirmishes were reported consistently on the border between India and China, which culminated 3 years later into a full-fledged war in October 1962. The war broke out after China objected to India establishing outposts along the effective boundary established by the Britain in 1914 between the Tibetan region and the northeastern India. By the time war ended, China had occupied the area it had demarcated in its 1959 proposal of LAC in Ladakh and taken over the Aksai chain completely. The situation has largely remained the same from that time until now. Later, in 1963, Pakistan ceded the Shaksgam Valley or the Trans-Karakoram Tract to China, which it occupied in 1947-48 conflict with India. Since then, India and China have engaged in confidence-building measures on the border with bilateral agreements signed in the year 1993, 1996, 2005, 2012 and even 2013. The latest India-China border agreement of 2013 emphasized that neither side shall use military capability against the other side. With the experience of face-offs over the years, a caveat was added that the two sides shall not follow or tail patrols of the other side where there is no understanding of the LAC. These agreements that gave rise to the functional protocols and drills of the face-to-face encounters of patrols were unable to cope with the newly arising claims and fresh areas. Deliberately, China disallowed all attempts to fixate the LAC on ground and on the maps. Fast forward to 2020, on June 15, Ladakh's Galwan Valley witnessed a violent clash between the armies of India and China. The clash, in which 20 Indian soldiers were killed, was one of the worst in 45 years and led to a military standoff with China and multiple rounds of military talks for the disengagement process. The core of this issue is the deliberate, deep desire of China to secretively occupy areas, create infrastructure and cause demographic changes along the disputed areas. China is a master in what is called the Salami slicing strategy. This strategy is the slow accumulation of small actions, none of which is a situation that provokes a war, but which adds up over the time to a major strategic change. Now that we have understood the India-China border dispute, in the next segment of this two-part series, we will turn our attention to the incredible ascent of China as the global powerhouse over the past few decades. This meteoric rise of China has profound implications not only for the region but also for the world at large, and it has played a significant role in the dynamics of the ongoing border standoffs and the response of both the nations. See you soon.